idea of today's presentation is just to give you a brief overview of the Mexican Notafilia. Basically, and I hope it will be brief. I'll try to summarize. Pam, can you tell me how much time do I have to make the presentation, just to confirm?
1 hour.
Okay, perfect. So I'll try to squeeze and please, if you have any questions, please interrupt me. I'll try to answer your questions. So first of all, what are we going to talk about? So Mexican Notafilia is not as large as our numismatic history. You know that Mexico was part of the Spanish, it was a Spanish colony. And so basically, so Mexico has a mint since the 16th century, but the history of paper money is much shorter than that. No? So we will talk about 5 different periods. Normally, when talking about Mexico in Mexican Notafilia, only are considered 3 periods. One is the private issuing banks, second is the revolution, and third is Banco de Mexico. But I'm adding 2 additional. One is the introduction of paper money, and you will see that there are some overlaps between those periods. And also there is another one that is the post-revolution, which is not necessarily the issues that were issued during the revolution, but are actually a kind of a conduit or a segue to the Bank of Mexico. So let's start for the beginning. Mexico was born as a country in 1821, and this was the territory that Mexico had. So it included the current Mexico plus a big part of Central America and also some states of the US. No, so Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California were part of Mexico. So the government, it was decided to create an empire. So it was the Empire of Mexico, and the empire needed to make sure that it could govern all this territory. It was a really large territory, really underdeveloped, that was issuing after an 11-year of fight. The independence war lasted 11 years, and basically all the economy was in ruins. As you may imagine, what the new emperor and actually the junta that was passing the government to the emperor received a treasury that was completely empty. The economy was ruined. There was no enough workforce. The minings were inundated and or flooded, sorry. And so basically the conditions in which the Mexican economy was starting were really difficult, and there were not enough money to pay the army, to pay the public servants, and also to pay the court that was accompanying the emperor. No, so the person that we have here is Antonio de Medina. He was the Minister of War, and then he was also appointed Minister of Finance. He was in charge of making sure that he could find a way to finance everything. So so he came with a proposal. Just let me show you will see that the issue that I will talk in a minute, it will be the first national issue. That's not necessarily the first paper money. The one that I'm showing you here right next to the flag, it was a small issue that was issued during the War of Revolution, the independence. But basically what Antonio de Medina did was the first national-wide paper money. No? So these are the first banknotes. So Antonio de Medina suggested, let's create paper money to finance the economy. And he suggested to create 4 million pesos in 1, 2, and 10 pesos banknotes. As you can see, they were very crude. So they were not sophisticated. They were printed only in one side, and they were particularly easy to be forged. So counterfeits appeared. There was a lot of doubts about also how to pay with those banknotes, because the conditions to use them was that any payment above 3 pesos should be done with 1/3 of the amount in paper. No? And so basically 1 peso would be paid in paper and 2 pesos would be paid in silver. So people was asking, well, and if I don't have paper, can I pay everything on silver or in gold? And so there were a lot of doubts. They were clarifying whether to use of that, and in the process, some counterfeits appeared, and there were many doubts. People were not confident on this. They were used to paying silver and gold, and there was a lot of mistrust. So they said, okay, let's try to find a way to prevent forging these banknotes. And in that period, which is a less than 6 month period, the empire fell and a new republic was launched. So basically, the paper money of the empire was worthless, but they decided, let's substitute the money that we have, the empire was issued, because actually the new republic actually didn't have money. So basically the economic conditions that they found were not only similar, but even worse than the ones that received the Mexican empire. So they issued some bonds also in 1, 2, and 10 pesos notes in order to replace the money that was out there. And interestingly, this used something that had two objectives. First is how to make sure that people would accept it, and how it also would make more complicated for forgers to forge those banknotes. So they printed that on the back of papal bulls. So I don't know if you know the term, but basically some old church documents that were printed in one side, they printed the banknote on the back of that. So they thought that using those papal bulls would make sure that people accept it because of the religiosity of those people, and also it would complicate more the forging of those banknotes. However, these notes were not necessarily well accepted. People continued complaining about the use and requested to receive silver or gold. So basically, those are the first 2 attempts of issuing paper money in Mexico, and were not necessarily successful. However, we continued seeing for a couple of years some documents that revealed that this paper money, both the empire and the one from the republic, that were still used in the territory of Mexico. Now, even if people didn't like that, the economic conditions of Mexico didn't actually improve. So basically, federal governments, local governments, and even private companies needed to find a way in which they could sort out things and to make sure that they move the economy. You know? And just you will realize that Mexico had, in between 1924 and 1964, in that 4-year period, Mexico had 45 or 46 different presidents. So you may imagine that the economy was moving at one pace and the politics were moving at a different pace. So each one of the governments were trying to issue their own money and to recognize and to organize the treasury. But with that many number of presidents, there was not enough time to make sure that they could organize the treasury and create a sustainable economy. So basically, paper money was necessary. So we see over this period a lot of different forms of paper money. This one explicitly says this is paper money for 1 peso. Those are some bonds issued for small amounts, issued by federal authorities, but in local in states. This is Tuxtla Gutiérrez in Chiapas. This is a bond to pay the army officers. These are not necessarily. This is also to resolve some debts. And the particularity of those forms of paper money is that they were issued. Some of them were nominative, but normally were issued to the bearer and would be paid on demand. So basically, they could be used to solve any debt by anyone in the economy. So formally, there was not paper money. There was no national issue, but there were documents that were exchanged from one person to another in order to pay debts. And that was not only for federal authorities, as I mentioned, this also applied for local governments. You can see here another one from the state of Nuevo León. And as you can see here, they transcript a couple of articles of the decree issuing those bonds. And it says these bonds will be paid to the bearer. And this one in particular has an interest. Not all of them produce some interests, but this one in particular had. And this one is from Nuevo León. This one is from State of Mexico. This one is interesting because, like the first issue of the Mexican Empire, that was only for 1823. This one is only for 1862 and only for the month of February. So the local authority, were issuing paper money month by month. So that's interesting. And this one is from the state of Tamaulipas. Of course, these were not necessarily exchanged nationwide. However, they showed the need of paper money. And private companies as well issued their own forms of money, even though they were issuing that without a legal basis. Basically, they were issuing some amounts of paper money just to solve debts and to pay their employees. So here are a few examples of that. Now, in the meantime, and something that we saw actually from the very first issue, from the one of the empire, the economists of the time, they were following what was happening in the US, in the UK, well, in England, in Sweden, in France, in Germany, and there were many proposals to create banks. And with the arrival of the Second Empire, there was a proposal to create a Bank of Mexico. No, so actually there were some banknotes requested to be printed in France that were presented with a proposal to the emperor, to Maximilian. Why don't we create a formal bank that would be a bank that would serve the government, that would finance the government, and it could have the privilege of issuing banknotes. They produced the whole project. They produced even some banknotes, but Maximilian didn't accept the creation of this bank and said he wanted to first see what was going to find when he landed in Mexico, and he didn't accept this proposal. So this proposal was not accepted, but in the meantime, one English investor arrived to Mexico and said, okay, under the Code of Commerce, I will create a bank. And this bank will issue some banknotes. So that's how, even if the original proposal that was presented to Maximilian was not accepted, he created, Mr. Newbold created, Guillermo Newbold is the person that is signing as manager in this banknote. He created a first bank that would provide banking functions, provide lending to people, create saving accounts, and he started issuing banknotes from 5 pesos to 1,000 pesos. There are on the next 10 years, the Bank of Mexico, London and South America, or London, Mexico and South America, was the only bank in Mexico, and it was the only, obviously it was the issuing bank. So they started with a very conservative approach, issuing banknotes, and they managed, there are several issues. that were issued, and they managed to create acceptance of paper money among the Mexican public. So that's how the banknotes started to be accepted in Mexico, and thanks to this very conservative approach that was being used. Now, obviously, there were some economic groups, local economic groups, that said, okay, why, if they are creating a bank, why don't we also create a bank? And particularly in the state of Chihuahua, which is a mining zone, a few miners asked the local government to allow them to start issuing banknotes. And they said, okay, well, we will grant you the right to issue banknotes, but you also have to provide something to the economy. So why don't you create a bank? So a few banks were founded in the state of Chihuahua with the concession not of a federal authority, but with a concession of a local authority. So these banks started issuing banknotes and also popularized the use of banknotes. As you can see here, there are some banks that are fractional, banknotes that are fractional. So you can find some banknotes of 25, 50 cents, also 1, 2, 5, 10, up to 20 pesos. And those are the denominations that were common at that time. As you, again, may imagine, people or other wealthy people said, okay, well, we also want to create some banks. So besides Banco de Londres in Mexico, in Mexico City, other banks were founded 10 years or 15, between 10 and 15 years after the founding of Banco de Londres, Mexico and South America. So that's how, in competition to this English capital bank, there were two banks that were created. One is the Banco Nacional Mexicano, which was a Mexican and French capital founded bank, and Banco Mercantil Mexicano, which was created with Spanish capitals. So these two banks started competing with the Banco de Londres in Mexico and South America, and they were opened with a federal concession. So basically, they reach out to the federal authorities to request the permission to issue banknotes, and then they convince the federal authorities, the Ministry of Finance, that they should organize the system and that everyone should have federal concessions. In 1884, there was a huge crisis, and these two banks, the Banco Nacional Mexicano and Banco Mercantil Mexicano, helped the government to solve the crisis and convince the government to issue a regulation that would be in favor. There were other institutions. There were some refractionary and hypothecary banks that were also issued. And one that is important to consider is the Banco de Empleados. Banco de Empleados was a bank of employees of the federal government that was created, that they produced these banknotes but never issued those banknotes. But it's important because of when the two banks, Banco Nacional Mexicano and Banco Mercantil Mexicano, helped the government to solve the 1884 crisis, they convinced them to issue a new version of the Commerce Code, and under this Commerce Code, which was very favorable to their interests, they merged themselves into the Banco Nacional de Mexico, and that would become the bank that would finance the government. And under this code, they were asking the federal government to revoke any issuing power to any other entity. Basically, they were trying to take out, to keep the monopoly and to take out the powers of Banco de Londres in Mexico and South America to keep issuing banknotes. So the Bank of London, Mexico, and South America continued issuing banknotes, but actually found a way, buying the concession of the Bank of Employees, to rename itself as Banco de Londres in Mexico, so only Bank of London and Mexico. And with this concession, they had already the permit of the federal government to start issuing. So they started having two different visions. The Bank of London and Mexico were asking for the diversity and the competition, open competition of issuing banks. And Banco Nacional de Mexico wanted to become the only bank with issuing powers. So these two banks were competing, and there was a kind of a limbo, a regulatory limbo, because the authorities, there was a huge lawsuit from Banco de Londres in Mexico against Banco Nacional and against the federal government. And on this time period, other entities started appearing with federal authorization, but only to local, with a local scope. So basically, we have a dual system in which we will have these two banks that were national banks. So basically, they could issue banknotes and they could circulate throughout the whole territory. And then local banks that only had possibility to issue banknotes on their own states or neighboring states. So that's how we will see, and you will see here some banknotes that were issued by Banco de Aguascalientes. I'm showing you where in Mexico these banknotes were issued and circulated. So Banco de Campeche, Chiapas. In Chihuahua, the state that I mentioned before, actually most of the banks merge under the Banco Minero. We also have Banco de Coahuila, Banco de Durango, Estado de México, Guanajuato, Guerrero, Hidalgo, Michoacán. Each one of these states were issuing banks, and you will notice something, that most of these states only have one bank, except for a couple. One is Nuevo León. And why we only see one banknote from each one of these, one bank from each one of these states, is because there were tax privileges to the first institution that would create a bank locally. So that's why we normally see only one bank on each one of those states. But one of the exceptions was this Banco in Nuevo León that had two banks. One is Banco de Nuevo León and Banco Mercantil de Monterrey. We will see another one in a couple of minutes, where we have Banco de Oaxaca, Banco de San Luis Potosí, Banco de Jalisco. That's interesting. As you can see, most of the images that I have shown you are banknotes from American Banknote Company. Banco de Jalisco is one of the few that had Bradbury's banknotes. Also, a few of the former ones, particularly those from Chihuahua, from the first state that I mentioned that started local banks, they had some banknotes issued by Omer Lee. But as you can see, most of the states started issuing banknotes with American Banknote Company. So basically, American Banknote Company kind of had the monopoly of printing banknotes for all the local state banks, and also for Banco Nacional de México and Banco de Londres in Mexico. Just one thing that I didn't mention earlier, on Banco de Londres, Mexico and South America, they started with English printers. Actually, there is an issue from De La Rue. There is a couple of other English printers, but they switched to American Banknote Company. American Banknote Company was basically the one that printed most of the banknotes for these local issuing banks. That's the second. Yucatan is the second state that also have two banks. It has the Banco Mercantil de Yucatan and Banco Yucateco. And something interesting is that in one of the reforms of the regulation, they merged under Banco Peninsular Mexicano, and you can find banknotes from Banco Mercantil and Banco Yucateco. You can find banknotes that are overprinted with the name of Banco Peninsular, and you will see also banknotes named at Banco Peninsular Mexicano. And the last one is Banco de Zacatecas. All these were not shown on a chronological period just on an alphabetical order. But basically, as you can see, each one of the states, or most of the states, I think that 828 of the 32 states of Mexico had their own issuing bank and issued banknotes over this period between 1864 and 1914. Some things that is interesting for those that want to collect this type of banknotes. So even if there are two national and some local banks, obviously those that are national have this this characteristic more present, but also some of the local banks had either overprints or small perforations of the name of the issuing branch that was issuing those banknotes. So you can see here that Banco Oriental de Mexico, as I mentioned, it is not only from the own state, but also neighboring states, and that the permission to issue banks and that the banknotes circulated also in neighboring states were just to recognize that the economy was not necessarily limited to the specific state, but to neighboring states. So you can collect banknotes that have no name. So basically, the name of no name of the branch, but also overprints of the different branches that issued banknotes. Also, some of the banknotes had some evolution. One were shown, as you can see on the right. One, it says 100 pesos in silver coin, and then on currency. No, the second one says on currency. So there are some minor differences between the different banknotes that were issued. You can see also some of the banknotes that you can find have some revised guilloches or small elements. You can find banknotes that have hand signatures and others that are with printed signatures. So you can find some varieties and curiosities of this. Another element that is relevant for this period of time is that the banknotes of all those banks had to pay the revenue stamp. And you will see on the back of of those banknotes a stamp that is printed and that is similar to the revenue stamp that was used on year after year. So banknotes that were issued in 1883, such as these ones, had to have the same stamp that was used for that specific year by the Ministry of Finance. So normally people only see the front of the banknotes, but also it's interesting to see that you can collect banknotes from different dates, and those different dates will have a different revenue stamp printed on the back. Finally, in 1997, there was a regulation issued that actually tried to order the issuing of banknotes and actually tried to order the whole banking system. And the new regulation established that there could be three types of bank: issuing banks that were the only ones with the privilege to issue banknotes, and those banknotes should be to the bearer on demand and would go from 5 pesos to 1,000 pesos. You can see that before I showed you a couple of images of banknotes of 1 pesos or a few cents, and that was not allowed anymore. That would need to be coinage issued by the Casa de Moneda, the mint. And so banknotes were possible to be issued from 5 pesos to 1,000. Then refractionary banks that were specific to facilitate mining, agricultural, and industrial operations, that they could issue bonds. And also hypothecary banks that were allowed to give warranty loans back with urban and rural properties, and they could also issue some specific bonds. So that clarified after this regulation in 1997. A couple of banks, issuing banks, were transformed into refractionary or hypothecary. And for example, the Bank of Oaxaca and Campeche disappeared. That's why those two banks are particularly difficult to find if you were collecting banknotes from the state issuing banks, and part of their activities were taken by the Banco Oriental de Mexico. Now, the revolution was approaching, as you may imagine, over all this period, after a lot of instability that I mentioned to you until 1864. There was a period of relatively stability when Porfirio Diaz arrived to power, and he stayed 30 years in power. He managed to make the economy to flourish, but also there was a lot of inequalities, and there were a lot of people that were complaining about the authoritarian rule that Porfirio Diaz was having, and basically started a political movement to remove him. So Porfirio Diaz was this president that lasted 30 years, and in 1910, Francisco Madero launched a campaign against him in order to overthrow him. We started seeing some local revolutionary leaders that supported the movement, and basically the idea was to change the rules. So Francisco Madero won the election, and there was resistance against him, but he managed to become president of Mexico. And then Victoriano Huerta, he was a military. He made a coup and overthrown Francisco Madero. And actually, this is the moment where the revolution became more violent, and that actually has an impact on issuing banknotes. Against him, Venustiano Carranza started a movement called the Constitutionalist Movement, and he and other generals like Francisco Villa, which is very known worldwide because of his very peculiar style, but also because he issued banknotes, and I will show you one in a minute. Also supported at the beginning Venustiano Carranza. There were other generals like Salvador Alvarado, but the constitutionalist movement split at some point. Some leaders supported Eulalio Gutierrez, and Venustiano Carranza kept his own movement, and that brought another version of the or another episode of the revolution that also confronted different groups. No? So Álvaro Obregón was supporting Venustiano Carranza, and all this, and I don't want to give you a lesson of the history of Mexico, but basically is to show you this. No? At the beginning, when Victoriano Huerta arrived to power, he first allowed issuing banks to issue without the limits that the regulation allowed. So you will see that late 1913 and early 1914 banknotes are much more common than previous issues, is because the banks were allowed to issue more money without the necessary backing. Also, we can see the reappearance of small denominated banknotes. So Victoriano Huerta allowed banks to issue not only 5 pesos and up denominations, but also 1, 2 pesos and even 50 cents. And also another peculiarity is that in these years, 2013, 2014, some of the banks started issuing locally or printing locally the banknotes. So we have here a banknote from Bouligny, which is a printer that was based in Mexico City. And that was because of the army conflict, and Venustiano Carranza was controlling the north part of the country. So it was not possible for American banknote to bring banknotes to the different banks. So they started finding local printers to print their banknotes. But this is only the start of the revolution. Then Venustiano Carranza created some banknotes under this constitutionalist movement, and those banknotes started circulating in different places. So either on the front or on the back, they started seeing some overstamps. So you have here a couple of examples of banks that were stamped to be revalidated on different territories. Also, Victoriano Huerta supporters and general supporting Victoriano Huerta issued their own banknotes because it wasn't possible for Victoriano Huerta to send money to all the different cities that were defending and combating Venustiano Carranza's forces. Here I have a one from the Gobierno Convencionista when the constitutionalist movement split. So you have the conventionists that were supporting Hilario Gutierrez issued their own money, and also they were, sorry, and I think that the transition is wrong here, but they also issued these revalidados, so that basically were banknotes similar to the ones issued by Venustiano Carranza, but with an overprint saying that it was revalidated by this government. Also, and let me go back just for you to know what I'm talking about. On the right, we have one 20 pesos banknote from Banco de Guerrero. This was a bank that was supported by Emiliano Zapata. On the left, we have here a banknote by Francisco Villa. This was called the Sabanas. It's like Linian. They were so white and big that they would say it was like Linian banknotes, and these have the peculiarity. Some of them are also hand signed, and some others are with printed signatures. But basically, Francisco Villa said, "Well, if we don't have money, let's print it." No, so actually that was the mood of the time. So it wasn't possible for a central government, either from Victoriano Huerta or from Venustiano Carranza, or even from Hilario Gutierrez, to send money to each one of the different cities that were fighting the revolution. So each of the generals started issuing their own banknotes. We have these very common dos caritas, the two little faces banknotes that are really common and cheap. We also have these banknotes from La Comisión Reguladora del Mercado de Nickel issued by Salvador Alvarado. So basically, each one of the generals started issuing or revalidating banknotes from part of of its movement. You can see, for example, that when the constitutionalist movement splits, Venustiano Carranza continues with his government, and Francisco Villa, that was supporting him, then he started fighting against Venustiano Carranza. So you have some banknotes issued by Francisco Villa that were revalidated by this movement. No? That's why you see the same overprint that you can find on the revalidados. Venustiano Carranza continued and actually overpassed by a significant amount the quantity of money that he said that he was issuing. And then finally, he will issue this last issue that is called infalsificables, the uncounterfeitable. But basically, you can see here that there is a myriad of small and large banknotes printed, most of them very crudely, not necessarily by security printers, but basically that anyone that could print a banknote printed the banknote, then in order to solve the situation of in the middle of the revolution. Now, that was not all, and here I'm only putting, in order not to put too many images, and I know that I already share a lot of images of banknotes, but in order not to give too many things, just to tell you, this was not it. So it was not only the military leaders that were issuing, or local authorities that were issuing banknotes, also mining companies, also the railroads system issued tickets that were used for small transactions by the local population. And even you can see some of these different issues overprinted by some generals that were validating or nullifying some of the different issues. So you can see there is a myriad of issues. I'm showing you here on the right side a few overstamps of this. So basically, you can also collect those banknotes by the different, not only the type, and there are different types of banknotes because some of them were printed with similar plates, but not necessarily the same exact plates. So you can find differences on the banknotes, but also you can collect the different overstamps. No, and what I put here is a quote by Venustiano Carranza said, "We will order the monetary circulation." So from the very beginning of the revolution, he said, "I don't like what Victoriano Huerta is doing with the banks. I will order the monetary circulation." And he always had in mind the importance to create a single issuing bank. So I showed you the last, with all this schema of the revolution, I showed you an image that included all the family of these banknotes, the counterfeitables, which were printed by American Banknote Company. So after a period in which a lot of very crude or crudely produced banknotes were issued, he asked fellow members of his governments to go to New York and to request a very nicely printed series of banknotes when he already thought that he had won the revolution. So these banknotes were put into circulation, and as part of his idea was to have a single issue that would replace all the different banknotes. So he made a list of all the banknotes that he was recognizing that would be exchangeable into this paper. And also he made something that he said, this will be backed in gold. Obviously, there was not enough gold, and this was aimed at failing because there was a rush to change these banknotes into gold, or in previous banknotes into these banknotes and these banknotes into gold. So basically, the government didn't have enough money to support the issuing of this. So even if this was an attempt to unify the circulation, it wasn't successful. But he said, okay, let's create a single bank. So this single bank, single issuing bank, was recognized by the Constitution of 1917. And they created these models. These models were aimed to be printed in Mexico by the Mexican Printing Office, which belonged to the Ministry of Finance. But temporarily, he could issue some banknotes printed by American Banknote Company. Here we have an specimen. The thing is that the conditions to create the bank were not met in 2018, and he postponed the implementation of that, and then he was killed. So basically, the Banco de la República Mexicana, even though the banknotes were produced and shipped to Mexico, the banknotes were destroyed, and we only know the proofs and the specimens. It's interesting that I haven't seen. I know that the banknotes were shipped to Mexico and stored and destroyed, but I haven't seen any banknote actually with a number and with the signatures by Banco de la República Mexicana. Then in 2020, the Monetary Commission issued some provisional notes. Obviously, as at this point, the circulation of silver restarted, but they needed to print more money, so they created some 50 cents and 1 peso banknotes by the Comisión Monetaria, which basically served to liquidate the issuing banknotes that were declared illegal, and they created those silver certificates, and that was in 2020. And the creation of the Bank of Mexico was decided. So the creation formally of Bank of Mexico starts in 1925. So that's the date of the foundation of Banco de Mexico. But the first banknotes were actually printed by American Banknote Company in 1921. So there are 3 periods, there are 2 big periods of Banco de Mexico issues. Those printed by American Banknote Company and those printed by the printing works of the Bank of Mexico. So on the left, you have like the three main families of banknotes issued by the Bank of Mexico, printed in the US by American banknotes. So we have equally like in the US, we had large size banknotes that circulated between 1925 and 1935. The first issue that was issued between 1925 and 31 were backed in gold. So that's why it's so rare to find a series banknotes. And then from 1931 to 1935, we continue having the same banknotes, but those were backed in silver, not in gold anymore. Then, similar to the US, there are some smaller size banknotes that is called the transition ones. I'm kind of critical about this classification of banknotes, but that's another topic. And then we have kind of the regular series that circulated between 1937 to 1978. And then the printing works have several families of banknotes with small differences that were printed here. So just a few details about the American Banknote Company banknotes. So the first batch of produced in Mexico was requested in 2021. It was 100 million pesos in 7 denominations. It should be printed on steel plates with planchette security papers in large size, similar to the large size banknotes, with special inks. They should have double numbering, series, and dates in the front. However, part of this, only the serial number was requested to American banknotes. The rest of the features were supposed to be printed in Mexico, just as a security measure. So they receive sheets of 3 or 4 banknotes, and those sheets were overprinted with the signatures, with the dates, with the series here in Mexico by the Office of the Ministry of Finance. Those are the characteristics that are defined on the bylaws of the Bank of Mexico in 2026. So we have small and large size banknotes, as I mentioned, and you can see here that the series, the dates, the signatures have a different quality of printing, and that's because they were printed here in Mexico. But here you have an overview of the different American banknote companies banknotes that were produced for the Bank of Mexico. I'm putting here the 50 pesos because actually if you see the 50 that we have here is different than this one, is because there was a large forgery of this banknote by Enrico San Pietro. The 50, the 100, and the 20 pesos were forged by Enrico San Pietro, and that created the Bank of Mexico, or that pushed the Bank of Mexico to replace all the 50s and all the 100s, but not the 20s or other denominations. So basically, this is a small overview of the banknotes printed in Mexico. If you want to collect Banco de Mexico banknotes, you can also find different types. You may imagine in 50 years, you will see some changes. There are some banknotes that have prefixes, others that don't have. The letters might have some difference. Some are italic, some are serifs, some others are sans serifs. Others have the dates in 2 lines or have the dates in different positions. Some have one of the signatories' name, the signatories' title in one. At the beginning was representative of the government, and then it says inspector of the banking commission. So you can have a lot of varieties, and each one of the denominations have some varieties. This in particular has these 6 different types. You can also have some black and red series. That's because the red series were printed by American banknotes. So as the production of banknotes needed to continue growing, the Bank of Mexico started requesting fully finished banknotes for low denominations to American banknotes, and only overprinted the characteristics that I mentioned to the larger denominations. Another point is that also in the reverse, similar to what happened on private issuing banks, there were some seals. One seal was from the Bank of Mexico, and the other one was from Bank of Mexico and the Ministry of Finance. The color of these seals are kind of a security measure. So you can see a lot of different colors. So if you want to collect also banknotes, you can collect by the color of the seals on the reverse. And this is how they were put. Now this is a proof that was printed by the Ministry of Finance, as I mentioned. These characteristics are similar to what happened to the revenue stamp, were printed by the Ministry of Finance. So the position and the color was part of a security measure. Then in the 60s, so from the Second World War, the Bank of Mexico started wondering whether they should create whether they should diversify the supply of banknotes, or they should create their own factory. So that only happened until the 1960s. So the 5 pesos notes was replaced by these banknotes: 10 pesos, 20 pesos, 50 pesos, 100 pesos, 500 pesos, 1,000 pesos. So basically, as you can see, and sorry that I'm moving really fast, but I know that I'm approaching to the end of the time. So basically, they created a family that was designed by Mexicans, but actually, and designed by Mexicans and printed in Mexico, but it was engraved in Europe. So the Bank of Mexico hired some renowned engravers from Italy, Germany, Switzerland, Spain, to produce the engravings of these banknotes. And then they asked some Mexicans to be trained in Europe with those experts, in order then to be able to not only design but also engrave the banknotes in Mexico. So something that is really interesting, and this is something that is, I'm surprised, no one has documented all the signatures that Mexico has had. All the signatures that you can see is only from one single date. It is not that I'm showing you 20 years of combinations of signatures. That's 11 signatures that belong to a single date. So you can imagine also, if you want to collect by signatures, that's a nightmare. But I think it's a curiosity that is interesting for you to take into consideration. Now, we also had inflation, so we didn't only reach the same denominations that was over this long period of American banknotes. So really quickly in the 80s, we started having a 5,000 pesos. The 10,000 already existed, but it was very rare from the American banknotes. But we have 20,000 pesos, 50,000 pesos, 100,000 pesos, and actually a 500,000 pesos was designed. It was not issued, but it was designed. And obviously, in order to reduce costs, they changed the watermarked paper that was part of all these banknotes. They changed it to banknotes without watermark, and all of them were blank in order to be able to use the same paper to any of the denominations. In 1992, they decided to take out 3 zeros to redenominate the currency. So they changed from pesos to new pesos. So 10,000 passed to 10 new pesos, 20,000, 20 new pesos. So basically it was the same design, but without the 3 zeros. And they then started designing new families of banknotes with a completely new design. So here you have an example of a banknote that was redesigned. You can see here it says new pesos still. So basically it's the new family. And then they came back to pesos regularly. And also they started using new substrates and technologies. So they launched a first series of polymer banknotes in 2002 with the 20 pesos. And then 2006, this version of the 50 pesos, and then a new revised version, much more secure, because this one was successfully forged, and they decided to create one with larger windows and more security features. Then we come to the current family of banknotes. That's a different concept. So they kept having historical leaders in the front, but on the reverse, they said, let's represent the different ecosystems and World Heritage sites. So I'm not going to put all the images of all the banknotes, but just here I like very much these sets of images that were produced basically as using the back of the banknote as if it was part of the landscape, no? So that's part of the idea. And finally, I want to close this talk where you can find more information. I was thinking we don't have enough literature of banknotes. However, by doing this slide, I realized that we actually do have. So these are the first catalogs of paper money. These two were produced by Carlos Gaitán in the 60s and 70s. This in the early 80s is the complete encyclopedia of Mexican paper money. That was replaced by Mexican paper money. There is this printed version, and I think that I recommend to have this as the most complete source of information about all the different periods that I shown in this presentation. There is a printed version in 2010 and a CD-ROM in 2017, if I'm not mistaken. You can also browse on the numismatic collection of Bank of Mexico. There is another site that is called Paper Money of Mexico, and that now is hosted by the US-Mexico Numismatic Association. This is the most complete information that I've ever seen of, because it has the decrease, images, signatories, and everything of the first period. It had nothing about Banco de Mexico, but it has everything about the previous issues, both revolutionary and the private issuing banks and some of the very early issues. This is a very nice book printed by the Bank of Mexico, the Mexican banknote. Actually, there is an English version of this one. That's another history of the money in Mexico that includes both coins and paper. Obviously, the bulletins or the journals of the US-Mexican Numismatic Association and the Mexico's Numismatic Association. There is a website called Billetes de Mexico, a Facebook page that has a huge, very nice collection of banknotes. For the early private issuing banks and early issues, we have this history of paper money produced by Banco Nacional de Mexico. This is about this in particular has some interesting images of banknotes that were part of a vault that was taken by the Americans in 1914 during the Second World War when they occupied Veracruz. So they brought part of the customs, the vault of the customs, and they brought back that vault in the early 90s. So some unknown issued banknotes were shown on this book. This is another book where I actually participated that has an overview of the revolution and private issuing banks and revolution. There are some small booklets by Claudio Barrey about the revolutionary issues. This is perhaps the most complete book about banknotes from the revolution. This is a very nice book produced again by the Bank of Mexico about the production. And for those who wanted to collect Banco de Mexico, Dwayne Douglas made 3 editions of this one. This is the latest, and it dates back from 2003, so nothing new to compile anything about Banco de Mexico issues since. These are 3 booklets that were produced at the beginning. In the 70s, there were books about 1 peso, 5 pesos, and 10 pesos. Alas, after that, no one followed that and tried to do the continuation. So what we have is this complete book about Banco de Mexico, but I think is, as I mentioned, is very out of date. This is a small booklet about signatories, only about the cashiers, not only about all the counselors and members of the board. And finally, there is someone that created a guide, an online guide about Banco de Mexico issues that you could visit if you are interested. So basically, that would be it. And let me stop here.